than the having the elevated or feeling high on top of the world, elevated mood. That's the most common symptom. And data like these are one of the reasons why this was added to the DSM-5 criteria. This increased activity is really a marker for mania. And then you can see down decreased need for sleep is also very common. Psychotic symptoms, which sometimes can happen alongside mania, are the least common symptoms, but can be a symptom of mania. But you can just see here how often these symptoms happen. Now, as I mentioned, that there are bipolar disorders. So bipolar 1 disorder, all you need to have is one manic episode, sometime during your life, having a manic episode. Usually, but not always, there are periods of depression. But to meet the diagnostic criteria for bipolar 1, all you have to have is at least one episode of mania. Bipolar 2 disorder, and these are Roman numerals, whereas DSM-5 is now just not a Roman numeral. Here you have something called hypomania, which is an episode that looks a lot like mania, except it's shorter, 4 days in length, and not quite as disruptive as a full-blown manic episode. So it's in some ways a less intense, perhaps less severe manic episode. It's called hypomania. So it lasts for 4 days, and you still might have this elevated mood, but it's not disrupting your life as much as an episode of mania. And for bipolar 2, you have to also have an episode of depression. So this is, in some ways, maybe more the quintessential example of what we think of when we think of bipolar disorder or manic depression. In bipolar 2 disorder, you have hypomania, and at least one episode of depression is required for the diagnosis. There's another disorder called cyclothymia or cyclothymic disorder, and this is a kind of a milder but yet chronic form of bipolar disorder. So remember, dysthymia, or what's now persistent depressive disorder, is a chronic sad mood. This cyclothymia is a chronic up and down, So not reaching the severity level of mania or depression, but just somebody who's got a chronic up and down mood, where they're feeling a little bit elevated, a little bit high, then it maybe turns irritable, and then they're feeling really low. So not nearly as disruptive as either bipolar 1 or 2, but this chronic ups and downs. It's pretty rare. We don't know that much about cyclothymia. One of the specifiers for bipolar disorder is called rapid cycling, and this picture is just indicating that within a 12-month period, a calendar year, to meet the rapid cycling specifier, you've got to have at least 4 mood episodes a year. And these could be any combination of a manic episode or a depressed episode, or just manic, just not likely to be just depressed, but you've got to have at least 4 of these during a 12-month period. That's called rapid cycling, which is exhausting for people who have this particular form of bipolar disorder. All right, I'm going to break out again and show a second film here, so we can see a couple of people who have bipolar disorder and what that looks like for them. No, not her, sorry.
When you look at this disorder, it's on a continuum with things that we all experience. We all experience happiness. We all experience getting too wrapped up over an idea or a goal or something exciting in life. And those, for the rest of us, are our greatest moments in life. And somehow, with mania, it flips, and it becomes this scary, out-of-control level of happy and excited and wrapped up.
Here I am. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning. Good morning. Good morning, 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 good morning. When I'm having a manic episode, I can't describe it as anything else but my thoughts they're screaming in my head, and it's not like voices talking to me. It's my own normal thoughts, but they're loud. I don't know how to describe it. They're really loud thoughts. I get stuck on the same words over and over again. It feels like my head's going to explode sometimes if I don't release the energy, and it's kind of embarrassing sometimes. It's the only way to make myself feel better.
It's like being on 1,000 jolts of some sort of electricity. So you just keep going, and you don't think it's going to end. And then when it ends, you're back in like molasses or whatever it's called, and you hope it goes away. But I don't want to go down that far again because it's just so gross and so disgusting. I don't know about how many times you keep coming back out. It's just you don't have that much. It seems like it becomes limited how many times you can keep going up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down.
He's really not able to work. He might be able to work Monday, and then Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then 2 hours Friday, but don't go along with that schedule.
I can't do anything when it comes to real life. Nothing. Because I can't hang out in public and have a cup of coffee. Can't do that. I have to come back here. My body hurts. 35 years old. I never thought any of this would happen.
Doug struck me as so similar to many of the people that I meet in that this is enormously painful, and he has such a clarity of what this illness has meant for his life because it comes and goes. And some days he can feel okay, and then other days it's back, and it's back with this horror that's grabbed him.
And I see the pressure it is on relationships with friends, and some friends fall away. This is hard because he's not always available to do things or be with people. He just can't get up that day. And some people know one friend who can't be there when they need them.
It's a deep, dark mood, low energy, can't concentrate, can't eat, can't sleep. I mean, torture, and it's pain. And sleep gets worse than physical pain.
It's agony to watch. I mean, this is someone that I love dearly, and to watch the suffering that he goes through. And there's so many times I would say I would do anything if I could stop that suffering.
Okay. So that's just to give you a little sense of what mania and depression in the case of bipolar disorder, somebody who has both of those. And the first woman who talked about just having all that energy and she didn't know how to let it out other than to just talk a lot and say the same thing over and over and over again. It's not the same thing as you might have heard that say, well, isn't that an awful lot like obsessive compulsive disorder? No, I mean, in her case, she did have to say the same word over and over again, but it wasn't like an obsessive need that was driven by anxiety. It was just she had this pent-up energy where she couldn't actually stop talking about no matter, and it wasn't a thought that would come, it would be whatever was in front of her. So I don't know if you could hear, but she was saying pomegranate, pomegranate, pomegranate over and over because she was drinking pomegranate juice. And it was morning, she had just woken up. So whatever happens to be facing her right then, one of her manifestations of this increased activity is running around, running, moving, and saying the same thing over and over again. And Doug, who talked about how difficult it is, when you're feeling really good, you don't want that to end, but but there was something kind of in the back of his head that was like, this isn't going to last forever, and then, brace yourself, enjoy it while you can, buddy, because then you're going to go back down to the dark depths. And for him, that was really, really excruciating to have those episodes of depression. So what do we know about what causes mood disorders? Genetics plays a pretty significant part of the story, particularly for bipolar disorder, where heritability estimates, if you remember all the way back to chapter 2, seems like a different semester probably when we were reading about the genetic paradigm back in chapter 2, but heritability of population estimate, remember, 85%. Though that's among the highest of all the disorders that we'll talk about this semester. So highly heritable. That doesn't mean that if somebody in your family has bipolar disorder, you have an 85% chance of developing bipolar disorder, because heritability is a population estimate, not based on any one family or individual. Heritability estimate for major depressive disorder is lower, about 37%, but that's still a pretty significant chunk of variance when it comes to understanding depression, that it does tend to run in families. With respect to bipolar disorder, research has demonstrated that the heritability is not only high for bipolar disorder, but among large samples of people with bipolar disorder, there's also increased risk for just major depressive disorder with no mania whatsoever. So there the genetic contributions are pretty significant. The book talks a bit about gene-environment interaction, so I won't repeat that. I'm just going to kind of hit some high points here. So neurotransmitters, this is boiled down to its super simple as simple as you can get when it comes to understanding neurotransmitters and their role in both depression and bipolar disorder. And so the neurotransmitter dopamine and serotonin, along with norepinephrine, have been studied extensively in mood disorders. The current state of the research is focusing on receptor sensitivity and looking at different pathways. So here in the, I don't know, that looks purple to you, is the dopamine pathway, the kind of pathway that dopamine takes in the brain, hitting on different areas of the brain, nucleus accumbens, the ventral tegmental area, substantia nigra. That's all the area of the brain that's associated with reward. And so people who are having mania are particularly sensitive to reward, whereas many of us, what does that mean, sensitive? Many of us would respond, like we might be happy if we won $10, but for somebody who's extremely sensitive to reward would experience extreme joy and overabundance of excitement and enthusiasm over receiving $10, whereas people who are not manic might just feel happy. And this kind of exuberant reaction is associated with the reward pathway in the brain, and particularly the transmission of dopamine, and a lot of research is focusing on sensitivity of dopamine receptors in mania, in bipolar disorder. With respect to depression, it seems to be kind of the opposite, where particularly with respect to serotonin, some receptors in the brain are undersensitive. They're just not responding to the presence of serotonin in the synapse, and I'm going to switch here to show you another picture that we talked about way back in chapter 2. On the bottom is a presynaptic neuron, at the top postsynaptic neuron. Neurotransmitters are released into the synapse, so that's the space in between two neurons, and then what happens when a neurotransmitter is released? Well, it can bind to, so a presynaptic cell releases some serotonin, it can bind to receptors on a postsynaptic cell. In depression, those receptors just don't seem to be as sensitive to the presence of serotonin as do people who do not have depression. Now, how do we know that? Well, most of this work has been done in somewhat of a backwards fashion, at least in terms of a reasoning. And so the reason that people think, for example, that serotonin receptors are not very sensitive in people with depression is based on responses to drugs. And so if you give, for example, a selective serotonergic reuptake inhibitor, SSRI, or other medications used to treat depression, you can kind of follow what happens in the brains of these drugs. And so people have reasoned that, well, if we selectively block the reuptake of serotonin, what we're doing is we're essentially making even more serotonin available in the synapse. We're not letting it be taken back up into the cell to just release it. That's called reuptake. We're blocking that, so serotonin is just hanging out more in the synapse, and there's more of it. And if we increase the availability of serotonin in the synapse, that seems to be associated with a decrease in depression symptoms. So maybe the problem in the first place is that the receptors just aren't sensitive to the regular amounts of serotonin in the synapse, and we need to increase that amount of serotonin in the synapse by giving these drugs. So we give these drugs, there's more serotonin available, receptors now are responding, there's more of it there, and we're fixing the problem. But this is backwards reasoning. So we're finding a medication, we know very much and very clearly how antidepressant medications work at the level of receptors and neurotransmitters in the brain. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's what caused the problem in the first place. That can get rid of it in some cases, but that doesn't necessarily mean it caused it in the first place. To use a bad analogy here, you are riding your skateboard across campus and you hit a bump that you didn't see, you go flying and you break your arm. And what happens? You go and you get your bone reset, and that fixes it. That's not what caused it in the first place. It wasn't the hospital that broke your bone. It was the bump in the road. But you go to the hospital, you get your bone reset, wear a cast, that fixes it. So the fix is not always the same thing as the cause. But in most of the disorders that we'll be talking about for the rest of the semester when it comes to understanding neuroscience of these, a lot of the reasoning has been done in this somewhat backward fashion. Now, not all of it. That's usually been the starting point. So now people have done other studies where they look using things like PET scans, again back to chapter 2 if you remember what those are, where you can actually look at the functioning of the brain in particular receptors. And even among people who do not take any antidepressant medication, you can see that the receptors are not responding in the same way among people who have depression compared to people who don't have depression, or even among people who have a history of depression and compared to people who don't have any history of depression. So a lot of our study about neurotransmitters has been started based on this backward reasoning about how a drug works, but that may not be the cause in the first place. But later studies have then tried to go in and examine how the receptors are operating in a group of people who have never had antidepressant medication, so it's not just a medication effect, or people for whom haven't taken medication in a long time, or people when they just had their first episode and they've never had depression, or people who are at high risk for developing depression. Who are people at high risk for developing depression? People who have a biological parent who has depression, and particularly girls. One of the things about major depressive disorder is that it's 2 times as common among girls, women, as it is men. Young girls, kids, anywhere from the ages of 6 to 12, there's no gender difference. Depression is equally likely to occur in girls and boys. But starting around adolescence, we start to see a big gender divide with more adolescent girls, women, developing depression than men. So women are at particularly high risk of developing depression, and women who have a biological parent with depression are at high risk. So then we can look at the brains of girls who are at high risk for developing depression, and we see that there are differences in the brain in the way their brains respond and the way their receptors seem to work, as well as just general structures and functioning of the brain. And so here is a picture of different areas of the brain that have been studied either using PET scanning or using fMRI. And these findings are among people who are either currently depressed, people who are not currently depressed but have a history of being depressed, and in in some cases, girls in particular who've never developed depression, but who have a biological parent who has depression, so they're at high risk. We see decreased activity of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, so that's in the top panel there, that dark blue area of the brain. It's a really giant area of the brain. Decreased activity there, decreased activity in the hippocampus, increased activity in the amygdala. The hippocampus there is in orange, hippocampus is in orange, amygdala is in pink. And then the anterior cingulate cortex, which is mislabeled there, the posterior cingulate cortex, there in yellow, it shows decreased activity. So these are some findings that, again, we see in people currently depressed, people not currently depressed but have a history of depression, which suggests that this might be a risk factor, something that might not just be a maintaining factor but potentially a causal factor, and people who are at risk of developing depression show this pattern of changes in brain activity. So we're out of time, so we'll pick up here on Thursday and talk about some social factors that may be contributing to the cause of depression, as well as some of the factors associated with causing bipolar disorder and treatment.